gentlemen, and welcome to you all to our second Master Series event of 2023. A bit of a dive into the dangerous world sometimes of geopolitical risks. Hopefully you've got your coffee and you're settled back ready for this one. I notice on those attending, we have some of our new free men and free women, so welcome particularly to you if this is your first Master Series event. I'm Stephen Wilkinson. I'm chair of the Master Series Working Group. These events are exclusive to our members and provided as a benefit of your membership and an opportunity to discuss and hear experts in a range of topics. This morning's event is a panel discussion with questions and answers. And I hope you will put your questions in. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. We can't guarantee we can answer everything. Please keep your microphones muted to prevent any background interference unless you are being invited to put a question verbally. The event will last for an hour and 15 minutes. We aim to finish promptly at 10 a.m. So it's your opportunity now to ask questions and find out more. Questions, by the way, put those in the chat box. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to our master, Nick Dunlop, to introduce the speakers and the session. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, good morning, everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people turning up for this event today. A dangerous world, how insurance is helping to navigate geopolitical risks. And I think for those of us, and that's most of us, who are involved in some way, shape or form in the world of risk and trying to advise our clients and customers as to what to do about managing, understanding and managing their risks, I think we all now realize that it's not only a very existential environment out there, but there's a great deal of interconnectivity between risks that perhaps are starting to manifest themselves in some tricky and difficult ways. So it's really great today that we've got three experts in the field who can start to help us pick apart what it means to horizon scan and what some of these things mean to the world of insurance. I'm particularly delighted that they're all colleagues of mine as well, which is a great thing. So I'm now going to introduce them. The first speaker today is Helen Galley. Helen manages the WTW Research Network, which is an award-winning public-private partnership. It harnesses over 60 partners in academia and think tanks from all around the world to form innovative collaborations with the risk management and insurance industry. Helen is also a commissioner on the UK's National Preparedness Commission. We have Stuart Ashworth, who's the head of WTW's credit and political risks for corporate lines of business, as well as being head of financial solutions and international business at WTW. His experience includes 9 years running the Asia Pacific arm of the financial solutions division of WTW, with responsibility for the financial solutions regional hubs in Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Sydney. And David Bagnall, who's over 35 years of experience and is WTW's Global Sales and Strategy Director for Natural Resources. And David plays a key role in driving global engagement around climate risk and the energy transition, subjects that we have expanded on considerably in this master series of events. We're very fortunate to have these experts with us, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Helen Galley, and I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this session because we have so much fascinating research in this space, and today I'm glad to be joined by two of my colleagues who will help me paint a picture, a vivid picture of geopolitical risk with specific examples of insurance solutions and also a closer look at the energy sector. I look forward to Stuart's Russian doll slide, which will clarify the differences between terrorism, political violence, political risk, And he'll also outline the range of specific risk transfer mitigation options available. And then David will put the spotlight on the energy sector, an industry that is particularly affected by geopolitical tensions. So let me quickly share my screen. We didn't go heavy on slides. They're more, they're quite visual, but they might help with our narrative. And as I set the scene, hopefully you can see that. As I set the scene, I want to structure my initial remarks under three headings. First, I think we need to look at both sides of the coin. Second, we sadly don't have a crystal ball. And finally, what can we do about all this? What is our next move? And you can see from all these pictures that I've chosen, there's always a human hand here. And I think it's a reminder that unlike natural hazard risks, for which insurance is very well developed, risks driven by geopolitics are man-made. And this has two consequences. This makes them very difficult to predict. Modeling is difficult, if not impossible, and we may prefer scenarios, and I'll come back to that. It also makes that risk potentially more systemic, and that has implications for insurance availability and viability. So first, at the risk of being pedantic, I prefer talking about geopolitical drivers of risk rather than geopolitical risk. Now, does it matter? Of course, I use the phrase geopolitical risk all the time as a shorthand, but I think the distinction can be useful for two reasons. As you'll hear from Stuart, there isn't sadly a magical solution called geopolitical risk insurance. Instead, we have geopolitical drivers that impact us in many ways and that manifest themselves in a variety of risks. And then the second reason is that there's always another side of the coin, and understanding geopolitical trends and events is important to prepare for risk, but also to spot strategic and growth opportunities. So, risks driven by geopolitics, would be risks driven by tensions between two or more states, but also when the global political and economic system is undergoing significant change. And examples of those risks are varied. It could be military, for example, forced abandonment because of an invasion. It could be security, terrorism, political, for example, export control on personal protective equipment, as we saw through during the COVID pandemic. It could be economic, sanctions, regulatory change. It could be social, migrations following social unrest or wars. And it could be also reputational risk. And we have seen an increased incidence of consumer boycotts on businesses. So these and more will affect organizations caught up in these tensions, and it will affect their employees, their customers, their assets, their revenues, their supply chains. So we may not have a crystal ball to predict, to model these risks as well as we can model, for example, hurricane risk, but we're not entirely in the dark. And on the one hand, it's same old, and a good understanding of geography and history gives you a reliable insight into the risks around the corner. And this is what this famous book argues. And this is useful, but it only provides a general direction of travel rather than fully fledged GPS with detailed directions and timings. And we know that there is increasing awareness of the relevance of geopolitical drivers of risk for corporates. Now, is it unprecedented? We could have a long debate about this, and there's no shortage of books on the subject, but there are three factors, I think, that exacerbate the situation. Now, today, the picture is complicated by the fact that our world is increasingly connected. And an example of that is supply chains. And I know that David will talk later about those rare earth elements that are increasingly, that we are increasingly dependent on for consumer goods like smartphones, LED lights, electric cars, but also for defense systems, for space technology and for green energy transition technology. The other trend is the growing importance of grey zone aggression. And you may have heard that term, grey zone being that grey area between war and peace. And this aggression manifests itself in a variety of ways that are not necessarily bound by geography. And this brings further uncertainty to our world of insurance. And a good example is cyber attacks. If they are initiated by state-backed actors, are they an act of war and therefore often excluded from insurance policies? And this was tested in 2017 with the NotPetya attack, which eventually was attributed to the Russian military. Mondelez International and Merck embarked separately on multi-year litigation with their respective insurers to settle whether they were covered or not. Now, the third complicating factor is that we face what the World Economic Forum calls in their latest global risk report a polycrisis. And that's a cluster of related global crises with compounding effects. We have a geopolitical crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have a climate crisis, and companies somehow need to adjust their strategies in this complex landscape with sometimes conflicting objectives. And David will give you an example of this in the energy sector. So what can we do about this? Now, the cyber example, I quoted just now, puts the spotlight, for example, on the importance of policy wording. Generally, a good start is a good understanding of trends and how they are relevant to your business. And let me take an example here, which is explored in our recent political risk index. Over the last 5 years, the number of countries expressing a strong Western alignment has fallen sharply. And indeed, many countries have actually consciously de-aligned, and seem to be playing superpowers off against each other. Now, this sounds more subtle than earth-shattering, and yet it can have important business consequences. And maybe actually it's more useful to spot these things when they are subtle, rather than when they blow up in a more obvious way. And why is this type of analysis relevant? Well, we find, for example, that geopolitical alignment doesn't necessarily dictate trading relationships, but it is increasingly driving investment risk, and that might be very relevant for your business. Now, another way to increase your preparedness to geopolitical risk is to look at short, medium-term risks. And here you can see a sneak preview of some of the concerns highlighted in our forthcoming political risk survey across a range of sectors. Now, there are many such lists. This is one of them, many such surveys. They all suffer from bias. For example, the recency bias, which gives greater importance to the most recent events. So what's important is actually, I think, to look at a variety of opinions, a variety of predictions, not just one list. Now, equally important, and this will be my final point, is to do something about, with all this, to do something with this understanding of geopolitical drivers of risk. And as I said, probabilistic modeling is not really an option in this field, but there are still ways of quantifying possible impacts of geopolitical events. And that's a good way of doing this is via scenarios. And here are some of the scenarios that we designed with our network of experts and that we test on our clients. Our Russian intervention scenario actually goes back to May 2021. So before the recent invasion. So I think we can take that one, unfortunately. But another popular concern at the moment is on China-Taiwan, and you can see here we've got a scenario on the Taiwan blockade, and with many experts, we've discussed this, and many believe that if China really took action regarding Taiwan, it would actually be in the grey zone in order to make a coordinated Western response more difficult. So it wouldn't be an outright invasion. Now, scenarios are a really good way of designing detailed narratives. which then bring to life some of those interconnected risks much better than the risk register would. They also allow you to explore the ramifications of impacts across businesses, across your business, across all functions. And finally, they help identify risk prevention, risk mitigation, and transfer strategies. And so I think it's a good point to hand over to you, Stuart, to talk a bit more about the risk management and insurance approaches to those risks.
Excellent, Helen. Thank you very much, and good to be on this webinar. And thank you for having us here. So what I was going to do was just talk a little bit about the geopolitical risks that are out there at the moment, and then touch on maybe some of the risk mitigation strategies that are out there that we're seeing, how the markets evolve and develop, what it's seeing, and what we might be able to expect for the future. So there's a lot going on in geopolitical risks. So it's quite a lot to try and cover in an hour, but I think the first thing to remember, and actually something Helen mentioned a second ago around kind of a recency bias, is there's a lot of focus on Russia and Ukraine, but economic nationalism was on the rise prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was actually on the rise prior to COVID as well, and these things have worked to exacerbate the situation. But if you cast your mind back, we've seen a lot of anti-establishment political movements over the years. It was only a short time ago we had the US Capitol building was attacked. We had the similar in Brazil with Bolsonaro supporters. There were riots in Chile and Hong Kong. So again, we're seeing a lot of that stuff building up over a period of time. And so maybe the reaction to COVID and the Russian invasion is a manifest of what's happening previously. Looking elsewhere, we've seen military coups. Again, if you look across Africa, we've had Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea. There have been disinformation campaigns. If you cast your mind back, there was a US airstrike in Baghdad that killed Iranian General Soleimani. So these things have been out there for a while, and people forget about this stuff. That wasn't a long time ago in the wide sweep of history. So it's important to remember that these things have been building up. But there is no denying that the pace of globalization has been severely impacted by the war in Ukraine. One of the challenges with geopolitical events is they're of an order of magnitude that changes the way everything works. And what I mean by that is there are kind of phase one impacts, which is the actual losses people sustain because of geopolitical events. But then there were countermeasures and there were issues around that, which means you get kind of a tertiary, secondary level of impacts, and that could be to do with sanctions and embargoes. And then you kind of get the third layer as well, which is the more complicated bit, because every risk that a client has is heightened, and you're looking at it through a completely different lens. And I think that's the challenge. And so trying to create an insurance solution around that is a very complicated thing to do. It's also worth noting out that disruption is not always felt equally around the world, and there can be a time drag as to how people see things based on geographical proximity. Helen has alluded to a geopolitical risk survey that we conducted recently. As a little sneak preview, we found that 86% of Western Europeans reported a net negative financial impact of the conflict in Ukraine. That was only 33% of North American firms saw the same thing. So actually there's a huge weighting around how people view the world. In contrast, US companies are far more concerned and pessimistic about China. They are scrambling to cover risks in China to maybe to get ahead of this decoupling, whereas companies in Western Europe don't seem as focused on that at the moment. So again, geopolitical events actually have a slightly more geographical focus. So what can we expect next? So we saw a heightened social unrest across the world before COVID. We are now adding in cost of living crisis, energy crisis in Europe. We've got inflation, unemployment, food shortages. The list goes on, so the indicators are not good. Helen, would you mind putting up the first slide? So this is just an interesting slide we thought we'd share with you. So the point of this one is that this comes from the, it's the World Food Index. And if you cast your minds back to kind of 2011, we had the Arab Spring. Now that arose in Tunisia based on high food prices, that people didn't feel that they could, they had enough money, they couldn't get bread, they couldn't feed their families. And it resulted in the self-immolation of an individual. And then that kind of created the spark that spread through the whole of the Middle East and led to a lot of regime change. Now, if you look at where the food prices spiked to after the Ukraine conflict, I mean, we are significantly above where we were. So if you take the Arab Spring and the food index as where you are likely to see political events, we spiked well above that, and it's dropped down a bit now, as you will have seen. You know, we've managed to get some grain shipments out, but again, all you need to do is, particularly if you're in the UK, is walk down to your local supermarkets and realize you can't get cucumbers, you can't get tomatoes. You know, there are ongoing concerns around food scarcity. So again, if you are in an emerging market world, if you're in a struggling economy, these are the kind of things that you take to the streets about if you cannot get access to foodstuffs for your family. So just coming back, I mentioned energy shocks, and I don't want to kind of steal the thunder of David, who will cover that in far more detail than I could, but it's worth pointing out that the shock to global energy markets actually led to social unrest in 92 countries in 2022. Now that's really significant. We would have seen that most dramatically in places like Sri Lanka and Haiti, but also that led to a food crisis that pushed sovereign defaults. So somewhere like Ghana have actually gone into a sovereign default. You then have Egypt and Pakistan also receiving international bailouts. So again, the consequences are not just physical, they are economic as well. So there are other factors at play. COVID, I mentioned it earlier, COVID led to a decrease in tourism. Now that was coupled with increased social costs. So a lot of economies around the world were dependent on tourist dollars and tourist revenue coming in. If you strip that away, you then bulk on additional social costs, then that is a problem. That led to a couple of different things. One was global financial stress. So according to the IMF, 15% of low-income countries are already in debt distress. A further 45% are at a high risk of debt distress. In emerging markets, 25% of emerging markets are at high risk of facing default. And these are significant numbers. So we've already seen Sri Lanka, Ghana, and Zambia in default, and there'll be many more to follow. The second issue to think about is the rise of strongman leaders. Again, a lot of governments came in. They replaced centrist governments with kind of the extremes on the polar sides, and they also wrestled away civil liberties and rights. You know, you have emergency powers being enacted by the governments. So that is something that we need to look out for more, because these populist governments like to push the boundaries geographically, economically. They're looking to align with different states with similar kind of values and ideas, which means we're going to see these building blocks created over time. So unfortunately, we're likely to see an increase in conflict, civil disorder, subversive attacks against critical infrastructure. So I think that is unfortunately our prediction for the next couple of years. So with that in mind, how do we mitigate these things? So we advise our clients to do a couple of things. We have a kind of a strategy based on measure, manage, and mitigate. The idea being is you need to understand your risk to start with. So you need to manage what your exposures may be. This is the horizon scanning that Nick mentioned. It's the scenario planning that Helen mentioned. Understand what could happen. And if something did happen, what would the impact be for you, for your shareholders? What risk tolerance do people have? Once you identify what your risks are and what your tolerance is, what can you manage? So what can you actually do to bring those risks down within that risk tolerance? And if there are things that jump out that you cannot manage through prudent risk management, what do you do about mitigating them? And what are the options available to you? Political risks is complicated, so you won't be surprised to hear that we have an increased number of clients who are looking at political risks. 90% of respondents in our survey reported a political risk loss in the last 12 months. And that was up from 35% only a few years ago. So who are these clients? Well, these are large corporates, traders, banks, multilaterals, increasingly private equity firms as well. So what I thought we might do now is take a little bit of a step back to explore what the insurance markets can actually do, what are the products that are available, and how they all fit together. And there's often a little bit of confusion around what is terrorism versus political violence versus political risk insurance. So I thought I might try and demystify. Helen very kindly mentioned the slide that she called the Russian doll, which is probably slightly unfortunate, but you'll see later on, they were originally in different colors. It was more browns and greens, and it was described to me as the insurance avocado. So I thought we'd change the colors, but what we're trying to get at here is what you have in a scope of insurance. So the first thing that people tend to buy is kind of the entry level is really terrorism and sabotage. And that also covers malicious damage. What you can also do is extend that to things like loss of attraction. So if the supermarket next door was attacked, there was a loss of attraction for your premises because you're in the same vicinity. So you can have loss of income and revenue based on that. But it's a great product. It's often bolted onto to property programs, but it's relatively limited in what its scope as to how terrorism and sabotage are actually defined. Helen, if you can click on, please. The next kind of layer you get to is if you want to kind of up by that product, you're looking at also covering strikes, riots, and civil commotions. We've seen a lot of this over the last couple of years, particularly, as I say, places like Hong Kong, places like Chile. We are going to see a lot more of these kind of events over the next, I guess, 6, 12, 18, 36 months. And again, this is public disorder. So this is rioting in the streets, this is strikes, and then again, denial of access, so the inability to get in. Taking one step further on, we have war and political violence. So that is what we try to do here is we want to make sure that we cover as much as we possibly can within these definitions. You don't want to be having an argument, on the steps of a courtroom as to whether or not your building was blown up because of war, civil war, rebellion, insurrection, coup d'etat. It doesn't really matter. You've had a physical loss, and you want to make sure that you can actually claim for that under the insurance. In addition to that, I think what's increasingly important is business interruption, so the loss of revenue arising from it. But you have those first 3 eggs. That's where the traditional terrorism market stops. Thanks, Ellen. So that's where it traditionally stops. So that's what you get, and that really covers your physical assets on the ground. Now, if we look on, what you then get is the extensions that come in if you look at the political risk market. So forced abandonment is a really interesting cover. This is where you are forced to abandon your assets, and we've seen this a lot. Well, you'll see it a lot in Ukraine at the moment, but we've seen it in the Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, where actually there may be no physical damage to your asset, but you can no longer stay there. It's not prudent for you as an employer to have your clients in a hot jurisdiction. So what you need to do is say, okay, that case, everyone's going to leave, everyone's going to get out. It's not safe. We can see the trucks coming over the hill. And when you do that, you're no longer in the care, custody, and control of your assets. So you are actually abandoning them. Now that may be excluded from a lot of traditional political violence covers because you're not controlling it. But again, it's not your fault. So again, forced abandonment is a key bolt-on that I think clients haven't traditionally thought about, but it's certainly come into sharp focus over the last couple of months. You then get the slightly more, I guess, complicated covers. This is where you're looking at confiscation. So this is looking at equity. So this is beyond the physical damage to assets. You're looking at operating licenses being cancelled. You're looking at selected discrimination where you are being targeted as a Western firm, which means that the laws are being changed to be punitive against you. An interesting one is forced divestiture. I mean, you don't need to look much further beyond Russia to look at kind of how that may play out. That is where your government, so it could be the government of the UK or the US, force you to divest your interests in a country. So they may say, look, actually, we don't like what's happening with the junta in Myanmar. We're going to force you to divest your assets, or North Korea, wherever it may be. These countries, and I think it's going to happen a lot more, that the countries can become international pariahs relatively quickly. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're forced to divest assets, and then you've got no recourse, or it's an emergency sale domestically. Obviously, that covers confiscation, expropriation as well, and then non-honouring of an arbitration award. Now, these are all slightly complicated insurance terms, and we could spend 2 hours actually going into a deep dive on each one. But again, it's making sure that if you have equity invested overseas, you can actually get that covered. So the final thing is currency inconvertibility and exchange transfer. This is the inability to get monies out of a country. So if you are operating overseas, you have 2 risks. The first is that if you're selling things domestically, what you need to do is to actually be able to convert that local currency into a hard currency, because often you cannot repatriate local currency out of a country. So you need to convert local currency into US dollars or euros or pounds. Once that's then converted, your second challenge is to actually get that money out of the country. Collecting tons and tons of local currency in a country is not terribly helpful when it comes to paying dividends or rewarding shareholders. So, and we've seen a huge uptick in this risk. It's because in a stressed geopolitical economic environment, people want to keep cash trapped in a country. So it's the inability to get that money out of the country. Thanks, Ellen. You can probably take that one down. I'm sure there will be some questions that arise out of this, but hopefully that's a very quick 2 minutes on how these risks actually work. But maybe a little bit of a quick overview before I hand over about, so what are the features of the market? So there were about 50 insurers who look at this stuff globally, who cover political risks. In theory, there's about $2 billion of capacity per transaction. It's up to 15 years tends to be the coverage. You tend to do a longer term policy for political risks because you want to smooth out volatility. election cycles, if you happen to be in a country that has election cycles, those election cycles tend to be 3 to 5 years. So what you don't want to do is buy a 12-month cover and realize actually, you're now, the investment you had was approved by one administration, the new administration has come in and they've decided that actually they no longer want to support that investment. So again, we want to have a longer term policy to cover that out. From an underwriting perspective, I thought it was worth touching on this. So political risks used to be considered like a CAT policy. It was low frequency, high severity. These didn't happen very often, but when they did, they were pretty significant. That is changing, which means it's having to change the way underwriters view the world, because we are seeing political risks occur far more frequently. Sometimes, they may not have the catastrophic effect that they would have done in days gone by, but it does mean there's a lot more losses, smaller attritional losses. And different clients have got different attitudes as to why they buy cover. Some want to buy it for small regular losses, others only want to buy it on an excess of loss basis because they want to protect against it. But the market is certainly changing. And the insurers are becoming increasingly concerned. As you can imagine, the prices are going up. There's a general tightening of appetite. I think people are now looking at the horizon in front of them. But again, it comes back to understanding what clients want to do. And so that's really where this consultation comes in. And I think the solution is going to have to be, it's going to be multidisciplined. It's going to be across insurance pillars, across client communities, to work out what are the risks that we're facing. How could I as a client be impacted by political risks? And therefore, what can I do to mitigate it? But actually, it's not been felt more acutely anywhere than in the energy sector. So at that point, I'm sure there'll be questions at the end, but I'm going to hand over to David, if I may, who will talk to us about what this means for the energy markets and how geopolitics are impacting the natural resources area. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Helen, could we go to my first slide if possible, please? Thank you. So I'd like to start by talking about how geopolitics is impacting energy security and supply. And part of the research that I did in advance of this meeting was to look at BlackRock's geopolitical risk dashboard, which gives 5 of what they consider to be the top geopolitical risks. The first one is what they call the Russia-NATO conflict, perhaps a little bit strong. It's obviously the Russia-NATO increasing tension. They're not actually in conflict. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the largest and most dangerous military conflict in Europe since World War II. The outlook, or what most commentators think, is that we're in for an extended conflict alongside a long-term political, economic, and military standoff. Moving to the second point, the US and China are increasingly engaged in strategic competition. Most recently, the US downing of a surveillance balloon has highlighted the increasing distrust and structural tensions between the US and China. Taiwan is also clearly a political flashpoint. Cyber attacks are also on the increase as the Russia and Ukraine conflict persists. Critical government and private sector networks, as well as infrastructure, are vulnerable to hacking and spying. Attacks are increasing in scope, scale, and sophistication. So we talked about the strategic competition between the US and China, but it's also driving fragmentation as both focus on boosting self-reliance, reducing vulnerabilities, and decoupling their tech sectors. The US is setting unprecedented semiconductor export restrictions against China, accelerating the decoupling. And it's actually passed some sort of new legislation. So in 2022, Congress passed 2 bills to bolster domestic industry. The first was the CHIPS Act, which aims to reverse the multi-decade long decline in America's chip manufacturing. The second is the Inflation Reduction Act, which will enable nearly $400 billion to be made available to boost clean energy and reduce dependency on China for important supply chains. But it's not just the US. In December 2022, both France and Germany's finance ministries, as well as Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president, called for a European version of the Inflation Reduction Act. And all of these issues, I think, are redrawing the geopolitical map. And finally, negotiations towards a revived nuclear deal with Iran have ground to a halt, and Iran's military cooperation with Russia and support for militant groups in the region are also increasing tensions. So this complex cocktail of issues is impacting energy affordability, energy security, and energy sustainability, the so-called energy trilemma, which governments and policymakers are having to balance very carefully as they move forward. So Helen, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So let's talk about affordability and the impact of inflation. So 2 years after the impact of the pandemic, global inflation has exceeded 10% in the UK, as shown on the slide, and also significant increases in other major countries. This has become a significant concern for economies worldwide. One of the net consequences of this is that demand is outstripping supply for many commodities. And we've also seen that energy structural importance is driving inflation directly and indirectly. So in light of these points, we're seeing an increasing sort of trend towards higher labor costs, labor shortages, and supply chain disruption, whilst the cost of project life cycles are also significantly increasing in the energy sector. Helen, if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The other thing that's happening is that global conflicts have intensified inflationary pressures. The world is in the midst of its first truly global energy crisis. This chart shows what's been going on. And for those of you who may not know what TTF-MA stands for, that is the Dutch trading hub for natural gas. And what we've seen, particularly since the Ukraine conflict, is that the price of natural gas has really spiked. And this has really been because Europe has had to pivot in terms of its gas supply. So it was heavily dependent upon Russian gas. I think it relied on Russia for 40% of its gas supply. That has now been reduced to just under 15%. I think all of the gas terminals within Europe, have increased very significantly. So there's much more reserves, and we're in a better position than we are sort of 6 months ago. And the US has really, come to the aid of Europe in that respect, in delivering those gas supplies. And if we can just go on to the my final slide, Helen. So how are companies responding to this? Well, they're accelerating their plans to develop cleaner energy. And there's been significant diversification across all natural resources sectors. But the challenge for this is that renewable energy relies heavily on rare earth minerals. And when you look at this chart, China tops the list for mine production and reserves of rare earth elements. And this is a group of metals that are critical for a greener economy. Although Vietnam and Brazil have the second and third most reserves of rare earth minerals respectively, their mine production is low. And if you look at the US, they've got 1.5 million tons in reserves, but they are largely dependent on imports from China for refined rare earth minerals. So China's dominance in this space has not been an accident. It's really been years of research and industrial policy that have helped the nation develop a superior position in the market. China now has the ability to control production and availability of these valuable metals. So this tight control of supply of these important metals has the world searching for its own supplies. But China has a strong foothold in the supply chain and produced 85% of the world's refined rare earth elements in 2020. So it's a very complex picture out there, and there are a lot of interconnected risks, as Nick outlined at the top of this meeting, which are causing companies across the natural resources sector and governments and policymakers some real challenges. And it really is starting to redraw the cartography of geopolitical power, as Helen indicated in her overview. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Helen. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Stuart. And I think we will now open for questions. Feel free to put something in the chat, or if you'd rather say your question, take the microphone. Maybe, as we're waiting for the first few questions, I was wondering, David, if you could just extend a little bit, your remarks and talk a bit about the insurance reaction, the insurance markets reaction to this in the energy sector to this new deal.
Absolutely, Helen. So I didn't really cover that in my overview, but there is no doubt that there's been very significant insurance market impact. I think the most significant, obviously, is we've seen exclusions on Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine business, and that's led to the insurance market losing a huge amount of profitable premium. That's the first thing to say. So insurers are responding by setting insurance premium targets and in some cases writing off and replacing those premiums. We've also definitely seen increased pressure on pricing and much tighter scrutiny. We're also seeing terrorism and political violence exclusions, particularly post the Nord Stream 1 and 2 attacks. And I think we're also seeing more combined war and terrorism exclusions coming together. We're also seeing notice of cancellation and revision of policies moving from 7 to 14 days to 48 to 72 hours on the upstream side. And in some cases, I think we're seeing removal of capacity. Probably the most recent example of that was Lloyd's Munich Re Syndicate 457, their decision to withdraw from traditional upstream oil and gas business in 2023. And that's reduced the overall market capacity and is driving further price increases. So there's lots of challenges there for companies as they kind of adapt to these changes, but the insurance market has been very significantly impacted. I can see, Nick, your hand is up as well.
Yeah, well, I got a question, and thank you, everybody. I mean, that's a great walkthrough of the situation. I guess my question is, if I'm a customer and I'm starting to look at this situation in the round, what does good look like in terms of my behavior? So what do I need to do to understand this situation better? And then what does good look like when it comes to approaching markets? Obviously, we've seen tightening in markets. We've seen a new awareness amongst underwriters of what the challenges are, and that's manifesting itself in shifting in the way that the market allocates capital and prices. But I mean, what does good client behavior look like? How can a client help themselves most when it comes to addressing these issues? Maybe Stuart and Helen, you could both have a crack at that one.
Yep, I can. Helen, shall I go first?
You go first, yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Nick. It's a really pertinent question, isn't it? So what the insurance market want is clients who have sort of, they've been there before and they've done it before and they understand what they're doing, that they have a plan in place. So the first thing to do is to take a bit of a step back and understand what are the key critical risks for you as an organization. Now, with what's going on in the world, there are thousands of risks out there for risk managers to think about. It's like it's like a 9-headed hydra. There's every time you cut a head off, it kind of regrows double. So actually you need to work out which ones are critical. Not all risks should probably take up the same amount of time. You need to work out which ones are the critical risks. You need to make sure that you think about scenario plans. So what's going to happen in the Middle East? Are you overly focused? Are there exposures to China? Are your supply chains a bit too weak? And once you identify those, you need to then approach the insurance market, to look at what those solutions may be. And it's about the same thing. We've highlighted the risks that we want to do, and we want to think about how we can be intelligent with our dollar spend. Unfortunately, not every client is going to have the money to spend on every single risk for every single cover for the broadest breadth they can. So you've got to be, intelligent about, I've got a limited amount of firepower, and therefore I need to apply that in the most cost-effective way. That is about approaching the insurers and kind of doing a bit of a price discovery exercise, work out what risks you can lay off, how much it's going to cost, and then make sure that you're reporting that back internally to your shareholders and within the organization to say, we've identified these risks and this is what we're going to do about them. And insurers then go, do you know what, I'm now part of a well-considered, well-thought-out insurance strategy rather than just a last-minute panic purchase. And I think, insurers appreciate that. And also they want to see that you're there for the long term. I'm not just flooding into the insurance market now because the world looks a bit wobbly. This is about me making sure that my business is functioning, in 24 months, in 48 months, in 10 years time. So I'm looking at it for the long haul. So it's a consultation process. It's then collaboration. It's talking to the insurance markets and understanding what you can do, making sure you've got a very clear plan and strategy and how insurance allows you to execute that strategy in the most cost-effective way possible.
Is it I guess an adjunct to that is it evolving? I mean, this has always been something that larger corporations who operate across the globe have always thought about, but now is it sort of migrating into a place where businesses that haven't had to think about this before are now thinking about it, and are they doing a good enough job? I mean, what's your comment on that?
Well, if I've got the speaking stick, I'll carry on for a little bit. I think that's true. And so there's the idiom of kind of shifting paradigms is probably overused. You get everything shifting paradigms in every industry and every walk of life. But it's true in the sense that when you look at geopolitical events, everything changes. You literally apply a different lens, and all the risks you thought were either benign or manageable beforehand have suddenly completely changed. And the problem is it's hard to predict because geopolitics is predicated on human behavior. And that is hard to predict. If you look at, some of the things that Helen touched on earlier, and we're looking at kind of these power blocks being built, but even those are really nuanced and complicated. You've got Iran are providing weapons to Russia, but Russia are preventing Iran from pushing further into Syria. At the same time, Iran are then trying to talk to Russia about what they're doing with Israel. So actually all these things, these are coalitions that are kind of jammed together, but they're not natural fits, which actually means, you're likely to see a spillover in lots of different areas. So every client that we speak to has to think about these things they've never thought about before. If you're an oil and gas major, that's your bread and butter. You think about that, you manage it, you mitigate it. If you're just a simple, a more straightforward client, everything has suddenly come at you in one swoop, and all the assumptions you made have gone out the window. So you have to really think about those critical issues. What's going to shut off the business, and what can I do about it? So I think everybody needs to think about this in a lot more detail than they have done previously.
Thank you.
Add maybe something to stress one of your points, Stuart, that especially in large multinationals, those companies got used to globalization and just the feeling that you can be neutral in this world and you can just look after your shareholders, and increasingly it looks like companies may have to make choices. They might have to take sides, or at least consider the consequences of taking sides or not taking sides. And we've seen that with consumer boycotts, following the invasion in Ukraine. There are other cases of that where companies might have had a very small footprint in Russia, but the fact that they were keeping activities in Russia, had a massive backlash on their general operations, and these might not have been scenarios that they would have envisaged. And increasingly, I think it's important to look at some of those scenarios and play them out before things happen, because when things happen, it's just too late. These are reacting in anger leads to not ideal decisions. So just being able to look at a few scenarios like that and rehearsing them, playing them out with all the functions in the organization, I think that's going to be increasingly helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Nick, maybe I just I mean, I do think that scenario planning is key. And going through that is a really important process, because I think you learn a lot about potential strategies that you can employ, and then you can move forward more quickly if those scenarios actually arise. The other important thing, I think, is the cocktail of issues that are facing companies at the moment, so interconnected and complex, that, my sense is that you need blended resilience solutions. Actually, one solution area is not enough. So, that might be, Stuart's world coming together more with the analytics, team, for example, working closely with the natural resources lines of business together to sort of create that overarching perspective. I think that's important. And I think it's just, talk to your broker, make sure that you, make white space in your diary to think about, how things might play out and what actions can you take. You don't want to be caught on the back foot. And I think one of the things that we've all learned in the last 18 months, 2 years, is that when sudden events happen, if you get caught out, you really are on the back foot, and that's a difficult place to be. You need to be ahead of the curve.
Yeah, thank you.
So we've got a few really interesting questions coming on the chat. So I might start with your question, David, on the sanctions against Russia, and how far that could go, and what the impact could be on insurance. And I don't know. I mean, Stuart, maybe you can take that one.
Yeah, I can do. So sanctions over the last few years has become an increasing foreign policy tool, and it's been highlighted a lot by obviously Russia, but actually even before that, the Trump administration issued more sanctions than I think any administration had done previously. And the reason is it just avoids boots on the ground. Particularly after Iraq and Afghanistan, the US foreign policy was not willing to send, kind of young farm boys from Arkansas to fight in campaigns overseas. Sanctions was a pretty neat and efficient way of curbing economic activity, which has the same impact. Are they working on Russia? They are. The Russian economy is not struggling as much as people thought it would do. But there are various indicators of how an economy works. If you look at the ruble, that can be propped up by different means. But what is happening is Russia is really struggling to get microchips. And that is attriting their ability to prosecute the war. So again, I think, we're likely to see increased sanctions going forward. And I think, the UK will follow suit on that. So I think we are likely to see increased sanctions. I mean, the problem at the moment is, Russia can sell things to other jurisdictions, and they can buy things from other jurisdictions. They're being, sort of this Iran, India, China are all different locations where you can either sell into or buy from. So sanctions will increase from the EU perspective. It probably needs more global universal application of sanctions to be far more effective, but that is unlikely to happen anytime soon. That's my take.
And maybe we'll take your other question, David, before moving on to another topic, because your question is also on Russia. And I mean, on the one hand, I think the insurance industry has a good reputation for applying sanctions and being almost the enforcing that in many cases. But here you look at another maybe a blow to the reputation of the insurance industry, where it would, so certain situations lead to litigation and multi-year litigation. And as I was talking to cyber attacks, but here you're talking about disputes over leased aircraft seized by Russia. So I don't know. Maybe Stuart, again, what do you see from your point of view from clients and insurers?
So we had a situation back in 2000. It's if you bear with me for my flight of fancy. It was actually about Argentina, and it was de-pesofication. So it was when the Argentine government de-linked the peso from the US dollar, and that led to loads of loans going into default. And what happened is clients had bought political risk insurance kind of against non-payment of loans, and there was a big argument about whether or not the government de-linking the peso was actually a political event launched at companies, or whether it was just a an active economic kind of stateship that had an unfortunate consequence. And again, it went to court to try and prove whether or not it was actually covered by the political risk policies. And it was resolved in the end, but it highlighted to the industry that actually you need to be absolutely crystal clear on what it is you're trying to cover. And the problem is there are so many risks out there now that insurance, generally speaking, is not fully comprehensive. It is designed to cover a specific set of events, a specific set of circumstances, and the world's changed, which actually means it's a lot grey and a lot more murky, and there's all sorts of kind of correlated risks and losses that can arise. But again, what people therefore need to do is to think about, look, what am I actually concerned about? What are these risks? And if you lay out to an insurance company and say, this is what I want to cover, these are the circumstances I'm concerned about, they will come back with a price. And it's up to a client as a buyer of a product whether or not they want to buy that. If they decide, actually, I don't want to buy that, then that's fine. If the losses come in and you've made the decision not to buy it, that's a commercial decision. But as long as you're crystal clear with what you're trying to buy and what the insurance companies are trying to sell, and then you can work out whether or not you think that is a good return on those investment dollars. But I think it's important for all of us to then look at the landscape and realize that the products that we're selling, they may have been fit for purpose, or the way clients were buying things may have been fit for purpose in a previous world. Are they still mitigating the risks as they see it now? So I think there's a lot more consultation that needs to take place to make sure that everybody is highlighting the risks. So the danger is you go into the market and say, I want to buy aviation cover, and people didn't really think about exactly what that meant. And I think that's probably true of not just insurance, but of all things. Are banking facilities adequate for what people are looking at? Are pension facilities good? So people need to think about all these things in a slightly different light, which is where that shifting paradigm kind of analogy comes back in.
David, I might turn to you. We've got a question on innovation driven by times of crisis, and I wonder if you can look specifically in your sector of the energy sector. Have you seen examples of this for insurers, reinsurers addressing those risks and new products coming to light? Maybe I know you've looked a lot at the green energy transition, so maybe in that space as well. So just a few words on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing as a requirement for companies that we work with is to have a much more kind of scientific perspective on what their risk looks like and how it could play out. So we've been doing a lot of work with our analytics team who, take a much more kind of data-driven perspective on the purchasing of insurance, and particularly around risk optimization. How do you look at your policy, and is it still fit for purpose given the very seismic changes that have happened in the world? And that, I think, is a very valuable and worthwhile exercise to stand back and look from a kind of a risk financing perspective on where are you managing your risk, and what are you buying, and is it still keeping pace with the changes in the world around you. And what we often find is that there's significant spend in areas that actually are no longer really of critical importance, and that can be redeployed to another part of the business. So I think it's an important exercise, and can also have a cost benefit to those organizations. I think one area which we're going to need to perhaps see more innovation around is around supply chain and how that's managed moving forward, because I can see that becoming it's already a significant risk, but I think it could become compounded as we move forward. So I think there's probably more scope for innovation in that space and for solutions. And I know we're talking about that in Lime Street tomorrow as well, with a whole host of clients and markets. But I think it's something which we should be looking at more, because it's a global issue.
Now, we had a question on this crystal ball, although I said we do not have a crystal ball. I have to go to you, maybe Stuart and David in turn. What is the one risk that clients should look out for during the course of the year?
Yeah.
And if I go first, because it's only fair for me to put something in the ring, I think that we all carefully watching China, and we've got quite a bit of research on China and looking at the dynamics, and maybe not just China Taiwan, but just looking at the decoupling from China. How immensely complicated that is. If we think that things were complicated with Russia and Ukraine, decoupling from China would be more immensely complicated and has implications on we see friendshoring, reshoring of some activities. David, you alluded to rare earth elements. These operations have been left to China or countries in Africa for a reason, because this extraction is very, very environmentally polluting, and it's been convenient to leave that. Is it now time to reconsider this, but at a cost, at a local cost, local environmental cost? So some of these things, I think, they're not necessarily strategy, they're just happening, they've been happening, and I think it's something to watch. Is the risk of just focusing on major events and not looking at those slow burning trends happening. But yeah, Stuart, David, what would be your choice if you were put on the spot there?
I mean, I'd go with supply chain, for example. Really, I think that is an issue which is just really impacting the global economy, and we can see it in our own country today. And Stuart, you came up with some examples around that. It's difficult to look ahead in terms of how things will play out, but the ongoing conflict with Russia, Ukraine is and the associated geopolitical alliances, let's say, that are sort of emerging as a result of this conflict are causing those supply chain issues to become ever more complex, and trying to navigate those and see what happens next. And if there's increasing tension between China and Taiwan, for example, what will that do? And I think, Helene, you also mentioned that there is this kind of cartography of geopolitical risk that's changing. And we see those old alliances perhaps fragmenting. And that is all going to, it impact. It can impact quite suddenly, or it can impact in a slower sort of burn type of way over the next couple of years. But we are, I think, in a new world order. And how do we navigate that world order when there is, political tension and, the ongoing protracted war in Russia, Ukraine? So I would say that it's in that area where, is probably the biggest risk to companies, and how they manage the delivery of their products and services to their customers, and how do they actually get hold of the raw materials that they're going to need to deliver their product to their customer base.
Thank you.
And so from my perspective, I'm going to be cheeky and take two risks, if that's okay. So one's more short term, one's more slightly longer term. Short term, I think we've got to look at Russia, Ukraine. I mean, this is also mindful that, Helen, you've already touched on China, but so the biggest immediate risk is probably a miscalculation by somebody in how this is engaging. There was all talk about sort of fast jets and what gets provided. If you're sending in tanks, you probably need some sort of all-arm stuff. So, but then you don't want to risk an escalation. But unfortunately, I think what's likely to happen is this is going to be quite a long, protracted situation. I don't think this is going anywhere soon. As Russia run out of money and troops, or convicts, depending on which way you look at it, what is likely to happen is you're going to see more cyber attacks. Cyber is a relatively cheap way for somebody to really attack things like critical infrastructure. And it's been mentioned kind of on the call earlier, but actually it's quite easy for somebody to provide disinformation. And if we've got this kind of public resentment that's already bubbling below the surface, then actually you could easily see that seeing it spilled over. So either you've got direct cyber attacks into things, or actually you've got that sort of disinformation campaign, and it all kind of comes under that cyber example. then if you got 2 seconds, so one example I thought was interesting was in May, I think it was May 2016, as they were building up to the US elections, there were 2 Facebook groups that were established. One was called the Heart of Texas, another one was called the United Muslims of America. And what was happening, the Heart of Texas put up something on the Facebook group, and it had been running for a couple of months, but it said, can you believe that there's going to be an Islamic library that's going to be put into the middle of Texas? It's taking away, you know, jobs from people, and it's kind of the spread of Islam throughout Texas. At the same time, the United Muslims of America put up a Facebook group that said, can you imagine these American guys are going to be, you know, there's going to be a march against, they're going to try and burn down the, you know, the Islamic center in the middle of Houston, I think it was. And what happens is they organized get-togethers. On the 21st of May, the Heart of Texas got all their sort of hundreds and hundreds of people to turn up to the library in the center of town. The United Muslims of America got hundreds of people to turn up, and they pitted it against each other. Now, what was fascinating about this is that then once, you know, there's a huge riot, loads of damage. When they peeled it all back, they realized that there was no such Facebook group as the Heart of Texas or the United Muslims of America. They were both created by troll farms in St. Petersburg, 5,000 miles away. And what they did is they built up these campaigns with different people to get all these groups aligned to each other and then pitted them against each other to kind of cause destabilization during the US election. Now that is a pure example of the kind of disinformation and the use of social media to try and create those kind of issues. And I think we're going to see more of that going forward. We've got the US elections coming up next year. So I think that cyber attacks from Russia, and they are experts at doing this. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming. And the longer term risk, sorry to go on, I think is actually climate. Climate is the thing we've got to really keep an eye on. It's going to be quite easy with all the distractions that are going on at the moment between the Middle East, between, you know, what's happening kind of in Eastern Europe and China and Taiwan, to take our eye off the ball. Unfortunately, things are changing, you know, not in a good way, and we need to kind of, you know, grip the nettle and actually make sure that we implement some of these COP27 reforms and make sure that we're on top of this. Because if we don't, instead of 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to be past the point of no return, and that's going to create not just environmental issues, but political issues as well. You're going to have areas of the world that are too hot to live in, with not enough food, not enough water, and that is going to create a tidal wave of migration across Europe, coming up from Africa, and that is going to create all sorts of problems, and there's going to be government defaults, and then the whole thing's going to spiral. So the biggest risk is that we take our eye off the ball, and it's climate change, which is an absolute focus that I think clients need to be aware of, to make sure that we're running the business that doesn't keel over, at the same time making sure that we're kind of moving towards that net zero.
Thank you, Stuart. Nick, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, that was precisely my question, and I was I was waiting for somebody to mention it. But I mean, I guess, Helen, from your perspective, so you're very involved in the horizon scanning sort of work for lots of people, but I guess my question to you very directly is, do you think the eye has come off the ball on climate change? Because it is, of course, a massive accelerant of geopolitical instability. We had a very interesting CEO in here a couple of weeks ago at a CEO roundtable who chairs one of the world's kind of major groups looking at water scarcity and areas with water stress. London being one of the places in the world with greatest water stress, actually, which I thought was quite disturbing, quite interesting. But where does this now play out in the world of horizon scanning? Are people still taking it very seriously? Do you think we need to think a bit more about how all these things link together? That's my question for you, Helen.
Yeah, so we, you know, it's a bit grim. We have so much knowledge, we have so many models, you know, so much climate science, but you know, we have a huge knowledge action gap where, you know, we know that we're on the bad course, and you know, it's very difficult to get all the actions lined up and coordinated to change course quick enough, and it's not helped by the energy trilemma that David talked about, or the Pony crisis, where, you know, companies are faced with tough choices. You know, they've got to survive, you know, geopolitical crisis, energy crisis, and then, you know, how do they make choices that short-term choices that don't compromise on that energy transition? And David, you know, we did talk about it when we prepared this session, and you know, you were telling me about some, you know, worrying signs of companies having to actually dial down maybe their efforts for the energy transition. And so, I mean, climate scientists are becoming increasingly desperate about this. Some are actually, scientists used to be very, not turning into activists, and now you can see increasingly number of scientists stepping in and being more active and more vocal about the fact that their science is not being listened to and acted on. But David, maybe you had a few examples on examples.
I mean, look, the first thing I would say is with the oil price as it's high at the moment, right? So we've seen certain oil majors row back on their climate strategies, really, and putting more sort of money really into the development of fossil fuels in the next sort of period to 2030, whilst still investing in their move towards renewable energy. There is this balance between for those large oil majors to continue to satisfy their shareholder returns and make the profits that they're making in the short term, partly to satisfy those shareholders, but also to finance the transition strategy itself. So I think we're definitely seeing that in terms of some of the other points that you mentioned. Who would have thought that in Europe, which has got such a strong sort of commitment towards renewable energy, you're actually seeing the kind of more commitment now towards dirty forms of fuel like coal, and in the case of, I think Germany had banned nuclear technology, but there's some of that's being opened up again. So it's a very complex picture that we're seeing, and as the world continues to kind of burn fossil fuels and continues to have those emissions, that's in direct conflict with the green agenda and the pledges that have been made around the Paris Accord and COP26 and COP27, et cetera. So difficult to see how we navigate forward when we're faced with these kind of short and medium term complexities.
Yeah, and talking of pledges, actually, it's interesting because even when companies make pledges for, they outline their net zero targets for 2040, 2050. Yeah. Sometimes there is not much detail on how this will be achieved, and that has landed some into difficulties, being sued for not providing that clarity. And so, you're going to have companies a bit caught between a rock and a hard place and saying, well, do I make commitments and open myself up to criticism for not providing all the details, or do I just stand back and not make those commitments? But then, how am I going to be actually affecting that transition? So, it's very tricky, and we're looking increasingly at climate litigation, climate liability risk, which might be actually the one thing that worries companies even more than when you talk to them about physical climate impact, because it's easy to push those down the line, whereas climate litigation might be coming now. You could have an activist suing you now,
and it can really impact your reputation, which, as we know, it takes years to build a brand, but minutes really to sort of damage your reputation, and I think climate litigation has the potential to do that.
So we're up for time, and I know you're all very respectful of the timeline. So Nick, I think I'm going to hand over back to you to close the session.
I'll say thank you very much indeed, and I'm going to hand immediately to Stephen to close the session. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much. A fascinating session, really enjoyed that. If you want a recording of that, please contact our clerk, Victoria. She'll give you access to that. And to mention that just this week, I think, or last week, AMIC published in collaboration with the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors their report on navigating geopolitical risks. So if you're interested in this topic, please have a look at that. My thanks to Helene, Stuart, David. Thank you so much for the work and effort you've put into it, for your knowledge and sharing it with us. A quick call out for Jackie, your colleague, who helped us coordinate it in the background. To our clerk, Victoria, as always, for making the nuts and bolts of this work, and to David for handling our communication so professionally. And above everything, to my working group of Adam, AJ, the two Nicks, Claire and Sarah, for all the debate and the good ideas that go into making these. If we didn't get round to any of your questions, I think we did, but I apologise if we didn't. Just looking ahead, on the 18th of April, we are doing another panel session on numeracy and looking at insurers' moral and social responsibility to support their customers if they're vulnerable because of lack of numeracy. In case you're not aware, we're being helped by the charity National Numeracy to put this event on. That's the designated charity for our liveryman Nick Lyons during his current year as Lord Mayor of City of London. So that will be an interesting session. If there are any subjects you'd like to see debated or any high-profile speakers you'd like to hear from, please get in touch. Please tell me who they are and we'll do our best. Other than that, again, big thank you to Helene, Stuart and David. Very interesting. And we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.